Okay, so deficits are basically, you can say 5 types, or you can say 5 types of deficit are there. Number one is budget deficit. Okay, number one is budget deficit. Clear? Number two is fiscal deficit. Number two, fiscal deficit. Number three, revenue deficit. Number four, effective revenue deficit. And number five, okay, and number five is primary deficit. Is five primary deficit. Okay, now first of all, in this deficit we'll understand these three deficit first. Okay, now with respect to another these three, with respect to these two, sorry, we'll talk about once we'll complete our FRBM topic, that is FRBM Act, as I mentioned you in the beginning, the list of topics that we are going to cover in public finances, as well as once we'll cover NK Singh committee. Okay, so with respect to these two we'll talk later, but first we'll talk about these three. Okay, first we'll talk about these three. Okay, now you know the formulas of these three, so I am going to write those formulas in front of you. Okay, so when we measure budget deficit, so budget deficit you measure in this way, or you calculate in this way: total expenditure. So total expenditure here means your revenue expenditure plus capital expenditure minus total receipts. Okay, so total receipts here means your revenue receipt plus capital receipts. Clear? So this is budget deficit. Now when you calculate fiscal deficit, so fiscal deficit used to say, or is calculated like this: total expenditure okay, so total expenditure is revenue expenditure plus capital expenditure minus total receipts excluding borrowing. So you know that this borrowing is a part of capital receipts. So we are excluding borrowing. Okay, we are excluding borrowing. So after that, whatever receipts are left, okay, so after that, whatever receipts are left, so it is revenue receipt plus non-debt creating capital receipt. So you can say disinvestment. So in capital receipt there are three components. So we are excluding borrowing. So after that, what is left? Disinvestment plus recovery of loan. Okay, so this is what your fiscal deficit formula says. Clear? So I hope you have studied this thing. So it's a revision class. So I hope you understood this formula. Okay, don't worry, I'll tell you the question also, what nature of question will come from these types of deficit. Now when we talk about revenue deficit, so your revenue deficit we calculate in this way: revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts. Okay, revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts. Now one simple question that they will ask you the formula in your exam. Okay, so formula in exam like this: fiscal deficit is total expenditure, that is the difference between total expenditure and total receipts, whereas total receipts exclude the borrowing. Okay, yes, it is correct. Okay, or you can say budget deficit is total expenditure minus total receipt. Okay, revenue deficit is revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts. Okay, so this is what they are going to ask you, the formulas. Okay, so if this type of question will come, I hope every one of you will solve it. Yes or no? Please tell me. Now we'll see the application part. Tell me. Please tell me in comment section, students. Okay. Now this is the formula part. I hope you will, everyone will able to, you can say, solve it. Now if you see this budget deficit, okay, this budget deficit we stopped using after 1997, or you can say till 1997. Okay, we use budget deficit. After that we are not using budget deficit, we use only fiscal deficit. So okay, so we are not, or our government of India is not using budget deficit after 1997. So 1997 was the last time when we use this concept. Clear? Now okay, now first of all you have to remember that we are not using budget deficit. Okay, now in order to understand budget deficit and fiscal deficit, we'll understand it together. Okay, now you know that budget is presented on which date? Budget is presented on 1st February. Okay, so you can say on 1st February finance minister used to tell in the parliament the receipts she will collect in the coming financial year, like finance minister, okay, and the expenditure they are going to do in the coming financial year. Okay, so if suppose, now you know that in receipts we have revenue receipt and capital receipt. Now if suppose you have already arranged some borrowing, you have already arranged some borrowing before 1st February, so no doubt that borrowing will be a part of, capital receipt. So what I am saying that borrowing you have already arranged before the presentation of budget, before the presentation of budget. Okay, so it means that borrowing will be the part of capital receipts. Okay, that borrowing will be the part of capital receipts. Okay, so ultimately what government used to do, government used to show the budget deficit that this is the amount of borrowing I need. So whatever value comes, this indicates that this is the amount of borrowing we have to further arrange. I am sure that it is not clear to you, so I will give you one example. Now for example, you can understand in this way. For example, on 31st January, suppose you have 50,000 in your bank account. Okay, 50,000 is in your bank account and 20,000 has been given to you by your friend as a borrowing. Now you decided to purchase Apple iPhone next month, that is in the month of February. So you presented a budget to your parents. So your parents are parliament. So on 1st Feb, you told your parents that I have a total receipts 70,000. Okay, and you told your parents that your total expenditure is 1 lakh. So it means they'll ask you that how much deficit you have. So you will say that 30,000. So whatever value comes, that is 1 lakh minus 70,000. So this value is budget deficit. So basically the value of budget deficit says that how much borrowing you have to further arrange. So it does not tell about that how much borrowing you have already arranged. Okay, so value of budget deficit only talks about the value of borrowing, the value or the amount of borrowing that you have to arrange. So it does not talk about the amount you have already arranged. Okay, so remember this thing, that the value of budget deficit only talks about how much borrowing government of India has to arrange or have to arrange. Clear? So it does not talk about the amount they have already arranged. Clear? So, or you can say, or it does not talk about the value, does not talk about the borrowing, sorry, not value, the borrowing it has already arranged. Clear? So ultimately you have already arranged some borrowing for the upcoming financial year. Okay. So ultimately that value budget deficit does not talk about. That is why budget deficit does not give you the clear financial health of the government. Okay. So that is why we don't use budget deficit after 1997. Whereas if you see fiscal deficit talks about both the borrowing which you have to arrange as well as the borrowing which you have already arranged. Okay, the borrowing which you have to arrange as well as the borrowing which you have already arranged. That is why from the formula of budget deficit we exclude the borrowings. Then only you will understand the total borrowing needed. So can we say that fiscal deficit talks about the total borrowing needed for upcoming financial year? So I have mentioned that 17.8 lakh crore is the borrowing which government of India is going to take. So this is the FD, this is the fiscal deficit value. Clear? Is it clear to everyone the difference between FD and BD? Okay, so now you understood the difference between FD and BD. So again I am telling that BD value only talks about the borrowing which you have to arrange. It does not talk about the borrowing which you have already arranged. Okay, मतलब BD सिर्फ वो बताएगी कि आपको और कितनी बोरिंग लेनी है, ये नहीं बता रही कि कितनी बोरिंग आप ले चुके हो. Whereas FD की जो वैल्यू है वो आपको ये बताएगी कि कितनी बोरिंग आपको लेनी है प्लस कितनी आप ले चुके हो. तो एक तरह से टोटल बोरिंग बताएगी. Clear? Okay, so can I say that is why in this formula we exclude borrowing. Okay, that is why in this formula we exclude borrowing. Okay, now if you have understood this thing, so can I write like this, the relationship between FD and BD? The relationship between FD and BD is like this. If you see, FD is equal to BD. So BD talks about what? The amount of borrowing that you have to arrange. Okay, plus borrowing already arranged or already taken. Okay, so this is the borrowing that you have to arrange. Plus this is what you are already taken. So this is what, if you see in this formula, we are excluding that borrowing which we have already arranged. Okay, so that is why we are excluding borrowing. Clear? Okay, so this is the difference that you have to understood. Okay, so if in exam they ask you, like nowadays the questions are coming on the basis of assertion reason. Okay, so assertion reason. So if they give you the reason for removing budget deficit, so it is what, that budget deficit does not tell you the clear picture or financial health of the government of India. That is why we have stopped using budget deficit. So if question comes in assertion reason, so I hope now you are in a position to answer it. Clear? So this is what you have to remember with respect to BD and FD. Clear? Now moving further. Now when we calculate RD, so as you know that RD is RE minus revenue receipt. Okay, RD value is RE minus revenue receipt. Now there will be some value. Now whatever value will come, it will tell you this thing, that for revenue expenditure how much borrowing is needed. Okay, so whatever value comes, so it will tell you that for revenue expenditure, so this value will indicate that for revenue expenditure how much borrowing is needed. So if you have understood this thing, so you will see that as I told you that FD value will tell you the total borrowing needed. FD value will tell you the total borrowing needed. Okay, FD value will tell you the total borrowing needed. Revenue deficit value will tell you that for revenue expenditure how much borrowing is needed. So can I say with one thing with surety that FD will be always more than or equal to revenue deficit. Okay, FD will always equal to or more than revenue deficit. So this will be the situation always. Okay, or you can say FD will never be less than, FD will never be less than revenue deficit. Yes or no? How many of you understood this thing? How many of you understood this thing? Please tell me. I hope this is clear to everyone. Okay, so FD is always more than revenue deficit, always more than or equal to revenue deficit, but FD will never be less than revenue deficit. So this cannot be the case. Okay, this will be the case. Clear? So can we say that FD is a broad concept, or you can say FD talks about the total borrowing needed, whereas revenue deficit says this thing that out of the total borrowing, how much borrowing is required for your revenue expenditure. Clear? So if suppose FD, I am just taking one hypothetical number, if suppose FD is, or you can say FD is 100, okay, and in case 1 RD is 0, and in case 2 RD value is 90. So can you tell me which case is good for the economy, case 1 or case 2? So assuming that FD for both the cases is same, assume that FD is 100, so which case is good, case 1 or case 2? पता बेटा पता, ऐसे ही सवाल आएंगे आपके. Okay, you will not find easy questions. This is UPSC. Okay, so this is what application part. So which one is good, case 1 or case 2? Only one student has answered me. What about other? Yes, case 1. Okay, so again, if you have understood this thing, so can I say that taking borrowing is not bad? Okay, what is the concern here is that when whatever borrowing you are taking, where you are utilizing it. So if you are, most of the borrowing you are using for revenue expenditure, so you know that revenue expenditure is not responsible for asset creation. So we have talked about, okay, in the beginning session. Okay, revenue expenditure is not responsible for capital, you can say asset creation, and when revenue expenditure is not responsible for asset creation, it means if you have taken borrowing for that, so in future there will be a time when you are in a situation of debt trap. Okay, when you are in a situation of debt trap, it means it is a situation where you are again taking borrowing to pay the previous borrowings. Okay, so this is a situation of debt trap. Clear? So understood in this way. Okay, so that is why this is good. Okay, that is why this is good. If it is clear, so one last statement, revenue, or you can say fiscal deficit talks about total borrowing needed for the economy, but or you can say total borrowing needed by the government for the budget. Okay, whereas it does not talk about that whatever total borrowing you are taking, where it will be utilized. But when you see the fiscal deficit along with revenue deficit, then you will understand that out of the total borrowing, how much borrowing is utilized for revenue expenditure and how much is left for capital expenditure. So you can say the value of revenue deficit will talks about the utilization of such borrowing. Yes or no? Okay, so this is what you have to understood. Okay, now if you have understood this thing, so when we'll talk about FRBM Act in today's class, so there you will see that target of, so you can say in FRBM Act they have set the target that government must achieve FD 3% of GDP and RD 0. So that is why they kept RD must be 0. It means you must have enough revenue receipts for your revenue expenditure. So for your such expenditure which is not able to, or which is not responsible for asset creation, for that you must not take borrowing. So this is the advice. But unfortunately in our country we have to take the borrowing for revenue expenditure also. Clear? So this is what your FD, RD and BD. Okay, so these three concepts I have made you clear.